Chapter 4. Drew was starving. She'd always say she was starving when she missed breakfast or forgot to eat lunch, but this was different. She could feel her strength fading as the candle grew shorter. It didn't help when Stubby hopped off of the table and left the room, only to return a few minutes later with a bowl of some sort of beefy stew that he sat and ate, too far away for her to reach him. The stew smelled delicious. It made the hunger inside of her worse. "Have you done this before?" she asked, going over to the bucket with the water and getting herself a drink from the ladle. Stubby shrugged. "No," he said. He talked with his mouth full, she noticed. "I don't suppose I could get you to give me some of your stew?" she asked. "You heard him. I can't give you any food." "He'd really let me starve?" "If you don't pass the test, it would be more merciful if you starved. That's what he told me." Drew couldn't imagine anything worse than being hungry, though. It felt like there was something gnawing at her inside, some tiny animal eating her guts away. She knew that, though she should be hungry by now, she shouldn't be that hungry. She knew being freed of the asteroids probably had something to do with that, since she no longer was feeding those parasites with her own personal injury. Her body needed more food than before. Her body converted food into energy, she thought. What was fire? Fire was energy. She remembered the torches lining the walls. She remembered wondering who kept them lit. Then she remembered Mr. Winston holding one and it going out on its own because he didn't need it anymore. She remembered the torches going out as they left the corridors. He was doing that, she knew. He was doing it even though he wasn't touching them. If he could do it, she could too. She sat down on the floor, her back against the stone wall, staring again at the flame. If she tried, she could sense Stubby there, sitting next to the candle. She squinted a bit to look at him in that special way she used to tell if someone was lying, or sick, or sleeping, and she could see him there too, or some of him. She realized that was his energy flowing through his small body. She could see a warm spot in his belly where the stew he'd eaten was, could see small threads coming from it as his body digested it. She knew then that once she understood what she was doing, she could influence that energy. She could make him sick if she wanted. She could even kill him. The thought of killing Stubby, or anybody else, inkling or not, almost made her sick, and she decided not to think about that anymore. Instead, she turned her attention back to the flame. She concentrated on the area of the wick where the wick was turned into the energy of the flame. Flame was a lot like a living thing, she knew. It breathed, it ate, it gave off waste. Since fire breathes, she thought, it would suffocate if it couldn't get any air. She knew sometimes that was how people put out fires, by removing all of the oxygen so they'd go out. But she didn't know how to remove the oxygen, and even if she did, she needed to breathe too, as did Stubby, so she'd wind up killing them both. But people also put candles out by blowing on them. That wasn't cutting off the oxygen. That was adding oxygen. More oxygen would probably cause it to burn faster, she thought. What would happen if it burned faster? A lot faster. She reached out with her right hand towards the flame to give her something, a gesture to help her focus. Something seemed to awaken inside of her, something she'd felt before. It reached out towards that flame and, in a razor-thin beam that she felt instead of saw, gently touched its heart. The flame flared briefly, then went out, overwhelmed, plunging the room into darkness. Stubby uttered a startled gasp. "Now you'll need to light it again," he said. "No problem," Drew said, reaching out again, now that she knew what she was doing. She did the same thing, only this time not using quite as much energy, and the flame reappeared. She put it out again, then relit it, then put it out, then relit it. Now that she knew what she was doing, it was easy, and soon she had it going out and relighting it so fast it was like a strobe light. It was fun, she thought, actually forgetting her hunger. She never felt more powerful. She had never felt more right. She knew this was something she was meant to do. Mr. Winston was right, she thought, pausing after relighting the candle again. Her life, had she never discovered this, would not have been worth living. He was also right in that she'd never have discovered she could do this unless her life literally depended on it. She put out and relit the candle one more time as Stubby picked up the key to the lock on her collar and hopped down from the table, coming over to free her. After releasing her, Stubby led her down the corridor and up several flights of stairs. In spite of her exhaustion and her intense hunger, Drew didn't mind the walk. She felt power buzzing through her arms, her legs, through her head. She felt like she'd learned some ancient secret that only a few people knew. She could smell food after they came out of a landing on the stairway to another stone corridor and was reminded how hungry she was. Stubby led her to one of the heavy wooden doors and rapped on it with a knuckle. "Come," said a man's voice from behind the door, Mr. Winston's voice. Stubby pushed and the door opened, and he stood aside and let Drew step inside Mr. Winston's room for the first time. He closed the door behind her, not following her inside. What caught her eye in the beginning was the table, covered with dishes and food and a pitcher full of water. She saw oranges and bananas, meat and bread, vegetables. At this point, Drew didn't care what the food was, just that she could eat it. Mr. Winston was standing next to a chair at the head of the table, and he gestured that she should sit across from him. Drew seated herself and grabbed some bread and meat. She thought it was roast beef, and a container of horseradish to make it a sandwich, her hunger overriding her manners. Mr. Winston seated himself. "Congratulations," Mr. Winston said as she poured some water and began eating the sandwich. It was probably the single most delicious thing she'd ever eaten, she thought. In the silence that followed while she ate, she glanced around the room. It was obviously where he slept, she thought. There was a bed to her right, a big one with a heavy headboard and footboard and a deep red comforter. There was a shelf that went around the walls closest to the bed, and on that shelf were lined some transparent globes that were about the size of baseballs. Curious, she used her newfound ability to probe the globes further and discovered that they weren't glass at all. In fact, they weren't anything solid. They were like crystallized energy, sort of like soap bubbles that would pop with a touch. She could feel power swirling around the things and around the bed. It wasn't a lot of power, just a bit, but it was flowing like the offshoot of a mighty river diverted around this tiny island. There was a desk, several bookshelves lined with old books, more chairs and a sofa, a big fireplace, and against one wall, what looked like a tall mirror that had a red curtain over it. She could sense power radiating from it. On the back wall was another heavy wooden door, closed, and she could feel an immense power was behind it, too. Another door was on the wall to her left, but she felt it was a bathroom. There was a door next to the bed, too, that she felt was probably a closet. On the floor here, unlike everywhere else she'd ever been so far in this big, bewildering building, was wooden instead of stone, with big rugs that covered most of it. Throughout her explorations, Mr. Winston sat silently, not eating, watching her. She knew he could tell that she was exploring the room with her power, and he did nothing to stop her. "When you are ready, ask your questions," he finally said. Drew nodded. Her mouth was full. She took a swallow of the cool water to clear her palate. "Where is this place?" she asked. "We are in a special place between several worlds." He reached over and took an orange and began peeling it with a small knife that was lying on the table next to his plate. "How old are you?" Drew asked, taking another bite of her sandwich, which was nearly gone. Now that she'd been eating a bit that the hunger had receded enough to allow her to think again. I was born in Kentucky in 1842, he said. I see, Drew said, finishing her sandwich and taking an orange herself, peeling it with a knife she found just like the one he had. What do you do? I defend humanity from alien threats, he said. She looked up and saw him smiling at her. Would you have really let me die? She asked. Yes. It was a simple statement of fact. Drew could tell he wasn't lying. What kinds of threats? You said aliens? Yes. Creatures, some from other realities, some not. There are many different types, and they all have uses for humanity, or for the world upon which humanity resides. In any case, they consider mankind a food source, or a pest to be eliminated. You use magic to do this? Yes. Why is there a curtain over that mirror? Because while self-reflection is a valuable resource, it is not something one likes to do constantly. Drew nodded. Can I look into it? She asked. Go ahead, Mr. Winston said. Drew got up and walked over to it, reaching out and catching the red curtain with the tips of her fingers. It was cool, the fabric very soft and fine. Silk, she thought. She pulled it to one side until she could see herself in the mirror behind it. At first she didn't understand what he meant. She looked the same as always, she thought, though a little more tired, with bags under her eyes. Then she noticed that the reflection seemed to be a little younger version of her, more timid and scared. Drew pulled the curtain back over the mirror and turned to face Mr. Winston, who had turned to watch her while he finished eating his orange. Could you stop wars and diseases and stuff like that? She asked. I could. Why don't you? How do you know I haven't? He asked, an eyebrow arching, and she felt like this was some sort of test. I guess I don't have any way of knowing. Well, I haven't, just for your information. That's not our job. We don't defend humanity from itself. What if there was a disease that was wiping everyone out? Would you do something about it? It would depend. If the disease were naturally occurring, developed by mankind by accident, or as a weapon of war, no. If one of humanity's enemies created it, that would be a different matter. You really wouldn't use your power to prevent suffering. Not as a rule, no. Sometimes suffering is to our advantage. There's power in it. There have been times when I've used the force of the unimaginable suffering mankind has inflicted on itself to stop something much worse from happening. There are things out there, Drew, who watch us very closely for any signs of weakness. Incursions from these things must be dealt with severely so that they'll think twice before trying anything again. These creatures must be terrified of us. They must consider us the stuff of their nightmares. They must see us as cruel, implacable, merciless. I can't do that, Drew said. You'll learn. You'll have no choice. He stood up and stretched, going over to his desk. There was a small bell there that he picked up and rang. After a few seconds, the door opened and Lala came into the room. Show Drew to her room. He turned towards her. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we will begin your training in earnest. Lala will answer any questions you may have. Okay, Drew said, as Lala stood just inside the door, waiting. Sleep well, Mr. Winston said as she left the room, and Lala poured the door closed behind them. Chapter 5. Penny lay on his bed in his tiny room upstairs in the Briggs house, listening to Miss Briggs knocking around downstairs. He wasn't able to sneak the cat into the house. Miss Briggs watched him closely when he wasn't in his room, so he just stretched out and tried to sleep. He knew exactly where she was downstairs. He didn't know how he knew, but he could feel her pacing around down there, and he knew she was nervous, waiting for her husband to get home. Mr. Briggs had a temper. Miss Briggs was terrified of it. So were their sons. Penny, however, had seen displays of anger in his life that would dwarf anything Mr. Briggs could manage, and he wasn't particularly afraid. He heard the school bus pull up on the street outside and stop, the brakes hissing, the door opening. He heard the neighborhood kids getting off of it, many of them laughing and talking loudly, glad to be home. A few seconds later, he heard the door open and slam shut, and he knew Danny and Paul were home. He heard them having a quiet conversation with their mother, and then he heard them tromping up the stairs. They weren't talking or laughing at all, which was never a good sign. Danny opened his door, even though Penny had often told them to knock first when it was closed. He was grinning. Danny was 14, athletic, and not nearly as smart as he thought he was, Penny thought. He both looked like and took after his father. "Heard about what you did," he said by way of greeting. His voice was growing deeper, and he almost needed to shave. "What did I do?" Penny asked. "Put that Tommy kid in the hospital." "Woohoo, am I scared of you?" Danny said, glancing behind him where Paul stood. Paul was 12 and could always be found a few steps behind his brother. He grinned at Penny, too. "He's not so tough," Paul said. "What do you want?" Penny asked. "Dad is going to be really mad when he gets home that the school had to call Mom," Danny said. "Yeah, he sure is," Paul added. "He may get out his belt," Danny said. "He may whip you." "He won't," Penny said. "He'd get in trouble with Mr. Brown." "No, he won't. Mr. Brown was so glad that we took you that he won't care," Danny said. "I heard him. He said you'd have considerable something." "Latitude," Paul said. Danny turned and cuffed him across the face casually, and Paul stood there sniffing, trying to hide the sudden flow of tears. "Yeah, so Dad can beat you if he wants to." "Okay," Penny said, turning over on the bed, turning his back to the two boys. He could feel them coming into his room, knew when Danny came around to stand on the other side of the bed where Penny could see him. "We took care of that cat of yours," he said, his grin growing wider. "What did you do?" Penny asked, feeling a sudden stab of fear for the first time since the boys had come into his room. "Drowned him in the bathtub." "Yeah," Paul said from behind him. Penny let out a small sigh of relief. He knew Danny was lying. Still, the fact that the boy had considered harming his cat was enough to awaken the snake again, this time wanting to lash out to protect the only thing in the world Penny cared about. Penny took a slow, deep breath and let it out even more slowly. Then he did it again. "He's crying," Danny said. Penny did have tears trailing from his eyes, but they were tears of rage and effort. He clenched his jaw, but he felt the stirrings deep inside, the snake coiling up, getting ready to lash out, and he wouldn't be able to stop it this time. "Boys," Miss Briggs called from downstairs, "get cleaned up for dinner." Danny started at Penny for a long moment before sniffing and leaving the room. "Come on, Paul." Danny left the room, Paul following, and once again he felt that the creature inside him go back to sleep. He could feel its disappointment. Penny closed the door to his room and laid back down on his bed, where he waited until he heard Mr. Biggs come home a couple of hours later. Danny and Paul had gone outside and were roughhousing with some other neighborhood boys. Penny heard them come running through the door a few minutes after their father. They weren't eagerly anticipating supper, Penny knew. They were hoping to see their father get angry at Penny and possibly hit him. Penny, for his part, preferred not to worry about it. He spent his time trying to sleep, trying to connect with the rage and anger that seemed to have a life of its own and get control over it, or at least arrive at an understanding. "Penny, supper," Miss Briggs called a few minutes later. Penny sighed, getting up and going downstairs. Danny and Paul were already seated at the dinner table, Mr. Briggs sitting at the head, Miss Briggs at the other end. Penny could feel the brothers' intense concentration on him as he sat down across from them. Penny never particularly enjoyed food. He ate mechanically, not really paying attention to whatever it was he put in his mouth. The boys ate greedily, shoving the food in their mouths and then getting more. Mr. Briggs said nothing for a long time, dishing up his own supper and eating it, reading something on his phone. He hadn't changed from work yet, so he was still wearing the white shirt and blue tie that he wore every day, though he'd loosened the tie and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. The meal dragged on, along with the awkward silence, until Mr. Briggs had eaten the last bit of food on his plate. "I got a call from Mr. Brown at the office today, Penny," he said. His tone gave this bit of expected news a great deal of significance. "I'm sorry," Penny said. "He told me that boy's parents aren't pressing charges, but they were very upset at what you did. I have to tell you, it's quite disruptive for me to get calls at the office, Penny. Quite disruptive." "I'm sorry," Penny said again. "Mr. Brown said you had behavioral issues. He said you had problems in your previous placements," Mr. Briggs went on. "I think your entire problem is you don't know your place. My wife and I have opened our home to you, fed you, gave you a place to sleep, took care of your needs. We didn't have to do that. In return, you cause problems at school that make my wife miss 4 hours of work and cause me to get pulled out of a very important meeting with a client so I can discuss you with your caseworker. I think we've been very patient with you, young man, but our patience is nearly at an end. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Penny said. Mr. Briggs looked at him, eyes narrowing, wondering at Penny's tone if he meant it or not. "Very good," Mr. Briggs said, after a moment, as if deciding to take Penny at his word. He could feel the disappointment radiating from Danny and Paul, who were staring at him, both of them smiling slightly. In spite of the implication from Mr. Briggs that the matter was now closed, Penny knew that it wasn't. Since their father didn't do anything, he felt sure the boys would take matters into their own hands. The snake inside purred agreement, as if it knew that it would soon be allowed to do what it wanted. It was content to wait a bit longer. Chapter 6. The room Lala escorted Drew to was just up the corridor from her father's. It was smaller, but still larger than a room at the apartment she'd shared with her mother. She had a small bed, a dresser, and a desk with a chair. There were 2 big bookcases, their shelves crowded with books. A door to one side led to a small bathroom, complete with a shower. The door on the other side of the room was a walk-in closet, and it was there that Drew had to pause to catch her breath. The closet was, in fact, too large to be considered a closet. It was more like a room, though a room full of racks which held clothes of every type she could imagine. Drew thought maybe the clothes would be old-fashioned, the kind that people wore when her father was young, but she found several things that were similar to the clothes she wore all the time, including some T-shirts with images from bands and movies that she knew. Some of the clothes were quite strange, and not because they were old-fashioned, but because they were made of a material and a style that she'd never seen before. There were shelves of shoes, too, and Drew found several pairs that would fit her. "Where does he get all this stuff?" Drew asked, turning to face Lala, who was standing in the doorway at the closet. "I'm not aware, ma'am," Lala said, and Drew found it odd to be addressed that way. "Lala, could I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am," Lala asked. "Are you afraid of me?" Drew asked. "Of course, ma'am," Lala said again. "I'm serious." "I was serious as well, ma'am," Lala said. "Why are you here, then?" "It is my duty to serve." "Serve me?" Drew asked. You and your father, ma'am, and any others you may designate as being worthy of service. Are there many others like that? Your father has guests from time to time, other personages of great power. I am to serve them, though not to the extent that I am to serve him. And you, ma'am. Really? Drew asked. How often does he have these guests? Sometimes quite often. Sometimes it is a long time between visits, ma'am, Lala said. And you still serve, even though my father and I could kill you with a thought. Indeed, as I said, it is my duty, ma'am. Are all the Inklings like you, servants? It is the reason for our existence, ma'am. Drew left the closet, passing Lala, going over to the bookshelves, looking at the volumes there. Several were reference books, history mostly, along with some more obscure texts that she'd never heard of. Some were quite old, though some were new. There were no novels. I don't suppose we have a television set anywhere, Drew asked. I don't know of this television, ma'am, Lala said. Of course not, Drew said. She checked out the desk and found several sheets of a light brown writing paper and a selection of pencils and pens, including some that had to be dipped into an inkwell. She found a selection of inks, too. The paper was textured and interesting. She couldn't wait to sit there and write on it with one of the old-fashioned dip pens. Is this all the books? She asked. Oh, no, ma'am, Lala said. Your father requested that we fetch these particular volumes for you. There is a library with many more books. Show me, please, Drew said. The library was a couple of flights of stairs down and up a long corridor. It was a lengthy walk, but as tired as Drew was, she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep yet, and the thought of an unexplored library within walking distance was something she found too exciting to allow to wait until later. Lala paused at one of the heavy wooden doors on the corridor. This is the library, she said, ma'am. Drew pulled on the handle, and it opened easily. She'd prepared herself for disappointment, seeing the library was just one of the many rooms along this corridor, but the room on the other side of that door was much larger than she was expecting. It was as big as other libraries she'd been in, Drew thought, with shelves that went to the ceiling, stretching off for quite some distance. They were full, too, of books, thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of books. At the end of each row was a ladder attached to the shelf to allow a browser to reach the upper shelves. Drew could see Inklings and even a few people busy replacing books, dusting the shelves, sorting new books. Off to one side was a man and an Inkling who were busily repairing books that had been damaged. Drew could smell the glue they were using to paste pages back into binders. She turned and Lala was still standing in the corridor. You aren't coming? Drew asked. I'm sorry, ma'am, but the library is outside of my area of responsibility. You can't come in here? Drew asked. No, ma'am, it is not permitted. Drew felt a stab of sadness. That's terrible, Lala. Thank you, ma'am, Lala said. You can go now. Dismissed? Drew asked, uncertain as to how to tell Lala she didn't need her anymore. Very well, I will see you at breakfast, ma'am. Lala bowed slightly and left. Drew turned back to those books, that amazing room, and wondered where she was going to start. You're Drew? It was a woman's voice, and Drew turned back to see the speaker standing in front of her. It was a woman about the age of Drew's mom, she thought. Her hair was done up in a bun, and she wore a dark dress, a pair of eyeglasses dangling from a chain on her chest. She smiled at Drew slightly. Yes, Drew said. I'm sorry, what's your name? You can call me Bree. I'm the head librarian. Wow, Drew said. That must be amazing. The woman laughed. You're a book lover, I take it, she said, gesturing for Drew to step on past her into the library proper. Drew walked in, looking at the rows upon rows of books. Yes, Drew said. I don't think I've ever seen so many books in one place before. It's the largest library anywhere as far as we know. No other library in any explored world has as many books as we do. How many worlds have we explored? Drew asked. Bree laughed. You'd have to ask your father about that, she said. I just know we keep finding more all the time, and every time I send a team of Inklings and humans to gather up copies of as many books as they can and bring them here, catalog them, and shelve them. Interesting, Drew said. You don't run out of room for them? Never. The room grows as much as we need it to. You'll find that books are extremely important in your work. It's vital that we have books that cover every possible subject. We even have scrolls, copies of the ones that were lost in the library at Alexandria. I can't wait to start going through them, Drew said, and Bree smiled again. That makes me very happy. Your father is, shall we say, businesslike. He reads because he's doing research. He doesn't seem to read all that much for pleasure anymore. But he did? Drew asked. I've heard he did long ago, before I started working here. Where do you live? Drew asked. I live here, Bree said. Really? You never leave this place? She laughed again. Would you if you didn't have to? I see your point, Drew said. For the first time, she felt like she was home. Chapter 7. Drew spent a lot of time in the library over the next several days. She had regular lessons that her father gave her, assignments to perform, even tests to take. Most of her studies were in basic history, math, and science, though some of it was more advanced science, the sort of study that she would have not gone into for years if she were in regular school. There was also the math. Drew had always been good at math, but this was much more complicated than anything she'd studied before. Calculus, trigonometry, all sorts of other disciplines. Geometry as well. Her perfect memory served her well. She picked up the new subjects quickly. The mental training her mother had put her through was also helpful, making it possible for her to understand how things she learned were useful to her in her new life. Bree soon learned the types of novels Drew preferred to read when she wasn't working on her studies, and recommended several books that Drew enjoyed. Some of them were old and unknown to most people now, but some were quite new and strange and thought-provoking. Drew also developed her power and her understanding of how to use it, refining it, seeing applications for it, discovering more and more how it related to her world. After she had been there for 2 weeks, she realized that she hadn't been outside, hadn't even seen a window to the outside since she'd been there. She'd been busy, and when she wasn't busy, she was exhausted, but she still had no idea what the area outside of Margincourt looked like. One morning, she was having breakfast in her father's room, as she did on most mornings, scrambled eggs and bacon with cold, tart orange juice. Her father sat across from her, delicately eating his own eggs, sipping his coffee when Drew spoke up. When are we going outside? She asked. Outside? You mean outside of Margincourt? Of course. What else would I mean? You can leave this place without actually going outside. He took a sip of his coffee and turned slightly, nodding at the door on the back wall, the one Drew had felt the power swirling behind all the time. Though there is a path to the worlds we are responsible for defending, you can walk it and use your power to go wherever you want within those worlds. Can I use it to visit my mom? In theory, but we won't be doing that. You've started a new life now, one that your mother's not part of, and you need to accept that. Drew sighed, eating her eggs and bacon. There's the more mundane way, too, if you just want to walk around outside, though I don't know why you would choose to do that, he went on. What's it like out there? Drew asked. There's a village not far away where the Inklings and the humans who serve us live. A river flows through it into the ocean not far beyond that. Is there a beach? Drew asked. I've never been to the beach. No, it's rocky. But if you're lucky, you may see a dragon off in the distance. They have a breeding ground out there somewhere past the waves. Dragons, Drew said, feeling a bit breathless. Are you serious? Oh, yes. Gigantic creatures. Inherently magical, too. How do you know? I can sense it, but also they fly. And as you'll learn as you study physics, they are much too large for flight. There has to be something helping them. And that something is magic. Yes. Are they intelligent? Can they talk? I really don't know. I haven't had close contact with them. Could I try? Perhaps one day when you've gone through your training. They ate in silence for what seemed like a long while. What are we doing today? She asked finally. When we are done with breakfast, we're going to indulge in an exercise. A test, if you will. What sort of test? You will need to learn how to use your power to attack, to destroy your enemies. That is the exercise you'll be performing in a little while. How are we going to do that? Do you have some kind of war game you want me to play? Something like that. You'll find out shortly. Okay, Drew said, deciding she wasn't all that hungry anymore. After breakfast, he took Drew down the stairs, a long way down. To Drew, the stairs seemed to go on forever. How much further? She asked, growing breathless. We're almost there, her father said. The stairs did have an ending, she discovered, when they reached the very bottom. Her father took his key ring out of his pocket and sorted through the various big old-fashioned keys that dangled from it, selecting one and using it to unlock the heavy wooden door. He stood aside, letting Drew walk past him before he closed the door again, locking it behind them. The dark place on the other side was a wide, low corridor. Drew could hear water dripping somewhere. It also smelled bad, like rotting garbage. What is this place? She asked, whispering, even though she could hear her question echoing around. The dungeons, he said. What do you sense? She reached out. There's a man just ahead, and an Inkling. Very good, he said. Anything else? A lot of little things. Bugs. And rats, Drew said. You are no lover of rodents, I take it. I don't like rats, Drew said. We're not doing anything that will involve rats, are we? No, though we may encounter some. As long as they leave us alone, I don't care, Drew said, though her voice trembled slightly. They rounded a corner, and Drew could see a man standing in front of one of the closed doors that lined the corridor. He was tall, wearing leather armor, holding a short sword in one hand. She could sense him tense up when they approached, and she knew he was extremely nervous. He was young, she thought, not much more than a teenager. They paused in front of him, and Drew could see his sweat break out across his brow. Anything to report? Her father asked him. Nothing, sir. Quiet. The young man's voice was deep, Drew thought, and barely showed the anxiety he was feeling. Good. Well, let us in so we can get this over with. Yes, sir. The young man took out a key ring of his own, one that only had one key on it. He used the key to unlock the door and push it open. Stay here. What is your name again? Drew asked the guard. Gerald, sir, the man said. Yes, stay here. Drew's father went into the room, pausing to beckon Drew to follow. The room smelled worse than the rest of the dungeon. There was a strong body odor smell and something else he couldn't identify but didn't like very much. It was a small room with no furniture and a couple of buckets and a few torches and holders on the walls that sprouted flames as they came in. Drew could sense her father lighting them with his mind, just as she could have done. On the far wall was an inkling. It was a male, she thought, and he was shackled in such a way that he hung on the wall. He was only wearing a pair of torn, filthy pants. His eyes were huge, and as they came into the room, he turned to look at them. Drew saw that they were bright and almost glowing with hate. "Hello, Grimy," Drew's father said. "That isn't my name, and you know it." The Inkling's voice was cracked, and Drew knew nobody had given him any water or food or anything since he'd been chained up here. "What are you doing to him?" Drew asked. "Grimy is a traitor, Drew," he said, walking over closer to the Inkling. Drew could feel the creature's anguish. He was starving, thirsty, and hanging from the shackles for as long as he had was putting a lot of pressure on his shoulders and arms. "But that's no reason to treat him like this," Drew said. "Is it? Grimy, do you want to tell her what you were planning to do? Who you were working with?" Grimy said nothing, lowering his head and closing his eyes. His breathing was labored. "I know it was a tall man in dark robes with a hood. I snatched that much from your mind," her father said. He looked at Drew. "Grimy here was in league with our enemies. This place is protected, Drew. Powerful forces cloak it from our enemies. If they do find it, there are defenses in place to protect it. Centuries and countless lives have gone into rendering this place safe from our enemies. Grimy was a trusted assistant to me, and he was plotting to give our enemies access. They would have destroyed this place, killed me and you, and then moved on to invade the worlds we protect, which would then be defenseless." "Why?" Drew asked. Her father turned back towards the Inkling. "Why don't you answer her, Grimy?" he asked. Grimy raised his head again, opening those eyes. "So we can be free," he said. "So we no longer serve you and your kind." Drew's father responded, "You were created to serve me and my kind." "That was long ago. We have earned our freedom from you." "Have you?" Drew thought her father sounded amused. "Grimy, you know the penalty for what you've done. I decided to let you be a lesson in Drew's education as well. Drew, do you sense his life essence?" "Yes, Father," Drew said. "It wasn't as strong as a healthy, well-fed Inkling, but it was there. I want you to remove it from him." "What'll happen to him?" "You know what'll happen to him." They faced each other for a long moment. "I won't kill him," Drew said. "You need to stop being so squeamish about killing. It's a necessary part of life." "I won't," Drew said. "You will, if not now, then later." "No, I won't. I'll never kill, Inklings or anything else." He snorted when she said that, laughing at her, she knew. "You will kill. You will, or the entire human race will be doomed." "There are other ways." "Very well." He sounded resigned, and Drew felt she had failed some sort of test. He closed his eyes, and she felt his power rise, reaching out to Grimy. Grimy gasped, and she could see it in the way she'd learned, the power leaving the Inkling. It didn't take long. When he stopped, Drew turned to look at the Inkling. His lifeless body was even smaller than it was before. The skin dried up and wrinkled. She could tell he was dead. "Come," he said, turning, talking back out into the corridor. Drew followed, finally glad to finally be leaving that terrible place. Gerald was still standing guard. He was sweating profusely now, and she knew he'd overheard the whole thing. "Clean up the mess," Drew's father told him. "When you're done, go home." "Yes, sir," Drew said, and she could tell that, even though he had the horrid job of dealing with Grimy's dead body, Gerald would do that happily as long as it meant he could leave the dungeon afterwards. They didn't speak during the long climb back up the stairs, and Drew wondered if she had crossed some line, made some mistake that had him reconsidering her usefulness. She thought of asking him, but decided that he was not in the mood for talk. He led her back to the door to her room. "Go inside and wait," he said. "We aren't done with lessons today." Drew went in her room, and he closed the door behind her. She heard him walking away, the shoes clicking on the floor, footsteps fading. She sat on the bed, bewildered, not knowing what she should be feeling. "I can't kill anybody. I can't," she whispered. She could feel tears beginning, and she squinted her eyes shut, but they came anyway, leaking down her cheeks and her nose. There was a quiet knock, and she knew it was an inkling out there, Lala specifically, and she got up and opened the door, wiping her nose with her sleeve. Lala stood there looking nervous, holding a wooden box that was almost as big as she was. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the master insists," Lala said, stepping into the room without being invited. The rudeness was quite unlike Lala, so Drew did not know what to do other than step aside. Lala put the box on the floor, and Drew was inspecting it with her special senses, so she knew what was in there, even as Lala was tipping the box over on its side, opening the lid. Rats, 3 of them, big ones. They scurried out of the box, and Drew squeaked, leaping up onto her bed as they quickly vanished under the furniture in her room. "I'm sorry, mistress," Lala said again before backing out of the room, closing the door behind her. Drew felt her skin crawling at the idea of the rats in her room. It was silly, she knew, but she had always hated the things, and these were the biggest she'd ever seen. She could locate them with no trouble, too, with her training. One was under her dresser, and the other 2 were under her desk. She could reach out with her mind quite easily and do exactly what her father wanted her to do, she thought. Kill the rats, like she'd failed to do with the inkling. But still, they were rats. Nobody would mourn them. The one under her dresser peeked its nose out, sniffing the air with its little rat nose, looking at her with its beady little rat eyes. It went back under the dresser, and she could hear it gnawing at the drawers. Soon it would get into the clothes she had in there, climbing over her shirts, her socks, her underwear. Almost without thinking, she reached out quickly with her mind and snuffed the life out of the creature. It was over so quickly the rodent probably had no idea what happened, she told herself. After that one, she did the same with the other 2, just as quickly. She climbed down off the bed, knowing their little rat bodies were still there, hidden, but needed to be dealt with. She moved the desk away from the wall, finding the corpses of the 2 rats that had taken refuge under there. They were shriveled up, just as the inkling in the dungeons had been, all their life essences drained away. She knew Lala was nearby. All she had to do was call for her. Now that she'd finally done what her father wished, Lala would be free to clean up the mess. Somehow, though, Drew knew that would be wrong. It wasn't Lala's mess to clean up. Gingerly, she picked the bodies up by their tails and put them in the box before going to the dresser and sliding it away from the wall to find the body of the last one. She put it in the box with the other 2. Then she sat on the bed and cried. Hello, this is J. Franklin Evans. Thank you for listening to this episode of Stories That Suck. Did it suck? Let me know. Be sure to like and subscribe.